Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. I'm K. Shaukat Ali, Assistant Professor of English, Islamia College, Autonomous, Walembadi. I'm going to handle UGC NET coaching class on literary criticism and theory. It is an important paper in UGC NET examination. You can expect 15 to 20 questions from today's lecture. Let me introduce you what is literary theory. Literary theory is the process of understanding what the nature of literature is and provides a theoretical framework for analysis of literature. Literary criticism is the evaluation and estimation of literature. Literary criticism is informed by literary theory. If literary theory is the lens or framework through which a critic views a work, literary criticism is the act of analysis. Classical literary criticism. Classical literary criticism most probably began with Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Poetics, provided the first basic concept of criticism. Plato rejected poetry because of its mimetic nature. Aristotle advocated mimesis as a creative concept. Aristotle contribution Aristotle's contribution to criticism lays in his inductive treatment of element and kinds of poetry. He described the six main parts of tragedy and also outlined the concept of tragic hero. Aristotelian notion of tragedy became so popular that it is even today used for analysis of play. Longinus on the Sublime. It was written in 3rd century, defined sublimity as an echo of greatness of spirit. He listed five principal sources for sublime, the first two of which are largely the gift of nature and remaining three the gift of art. Longinus' five sources of sublime, they are grandeur of thought, capacity for strong emotion, appropriate use of figures, nobility of diction, dignity of composition. Longinus' idea of the sublime played a central role in the work of romantic movement of 18th and 19th century. Elizabethan period. In the Elizabethan period, Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry, it was written in 1595, was one of the earliest work of literary criticism in literature. Sidney considered poetry as the oldest of all the branches of learning and established its superiority. His work was the first serious attempt to apply classical rule to English poetry. Dryden, Pope, Johnson were the main critics of neoclassical age. Dryden has been called the founder of descriptive criticism in English. Descriptive criticism means analysis of existing literary work. Dryden examined Ben Jonson's play The Silent Woman. Pope, in his essay on criticism, it was written in 1711, attempted to identify and refine his own position as a poet and critic. He identified integrity, modesty, and courage as the main qualities of an ideal critic. Dr. Johnson was the last of the neoclassicists. His claim as a critic rests chiefly upon two works, Preface to Shakespeare and Leaves of Poetry. In the Romantic Age, Wordsworth Coleridge came forward with a new definition of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling and attacked new classical rules. Coleridge's concept of imagination in Biographia Literaria was his greatest contribution to literary criticism. He was the first critic to differentiate between fancy and imagination. He further subdivided imagination as a primary and secondary imagination. He revolutionized the concept of artistic imagination. The Romantic poet John Keats coined the phrase negative capability in a letter written to his brother George and Thomas on 21 December 1817. In this letter, he defined his new concept of writing. The Four Ages of Poetry by Thomas Love Peacock, first published in journal Literary Miscellany in 1820. The Four Ages of Poetry is a poet and novelist. Thomas Love Peacock's satirical perspective on the history and societal role of poetry. Poetry, like the world, may be said to have four ages, but in a different order. The first age of poetry being the age of iron, the second of gold, the third of silver, and the fourth brass. Defense of Poetry. A Defense of Poetry by Percy Bysshe Shelley. Defense of Poetry is an essay by English poet P.B. Shelley written in 1821 and the in first published posthumously in 1840. In essays, letters from abroad, translation, fragments by Edward Moxon in London. It was published posthumously. It contains Shelley's famous claim that the poets are the unacknowledged legislator of the world. The essay was written in response to his friend Thomas Love Peacock's article, The Four Ages of Poetry. The function of criticism. The function of criticism at the present time, it was written in 1864. Arnold says that criticism should be dissemination of ideas, disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. He says that when evaluating the work, the aim is to see the object as in itself it really is. Arnold is best remembered for advocating the touchstone method. His work, Study of Poetry, Essay in Criticism, Culture, and Anarchy. Types of criticism. Mimetic criticism. Mimetic criticism, it derives from the teaching of Aristotle. It examines literary work as an imitation, or representation of the world and human life. This type of criticism is seen in Plato and Aristotle. Now it is the characteristic of modern theories of literary realism. Pragmatic criticism, it evaluates a work of art in terms of its effect on the reader. It judges the value of work according to its success in achieving at the end. It was very famous in 18th century. Expressive criticism, it views a work of art as primarily an expression of the spirit, ideas, beliefs, values, or emotion of its creator. It judges how a poet imagines to operate his feeling. This type of criticism is found in Romantic period critics. Objective criticism, it views the work of art as an autonomous, self-contained object. It describes the literary work which is apart from the poet and audience. This is the characteristic approach of a number of important critics since 1920. Historical criticism. Historical criticism, it views the work of art as a product of the period in which it was produced. Didactic criticism, it interprets work of art in terms of moral, ethical, or political message that they convey. Biographical criticism, it interprets work of art in accordance with the biographical detail of the author. 20th century literary theories. Russian formalism. Formalism is a school of literary theory having mainly to do with the structural purposes of a particular text. Formalism refers to a critical approach that analyzes, analyze, interpret, or evaluate the inherent feature of a text. New criticism, it was influenced by Russian formalism but developed independently. The investigation centered around the literary devices and craft of the author with an exclusive critical focus on poetry. American New Criticism was formalist movement in literary theory that dominated American literary criticism in the middle decade of the 20th century. It emphasized the close reading, particularly of poetry, to discover how a work of literature functions. Structuralism, it is an interdisciplinary school of thought. It originated in France in the mid 1960s. Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist, wrote a book called Course in General Linguistics in 1965. His theory of the structure of language is considered as the origin of structuralism. Intertextuality, Julia Christou coined the term intertextuality in 1966, explaining that there are two relationships going on whenever we read a text. There is a relationship between us and the author, the horizontal axis, and between the text and the other text is a vertical axis. New historism, it is a literary theory based on the idea that literature should be studied and interpreted within the context of both history of the author and the history of the critic. Reader response theory. Reader response theory criticism is a school of literary theory that focuses on the reader or audience. It emphasizes the reader's role in creating meaning and experience of literary work. Archetypal criticism or myth criticism, it is a type of literary theory that interprets a text by focusing on recurring myths and archetypes in the narrative, symbols, images, and character types in a literary work. Psychoanalytic literary criticism, it is a literary criticism or literary theory which is influenced by the tradition of psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud. It employs some of the techniques of psychoanalysis in interpretation of literature. Feminist literary criticism, it began to counter, resist, eventually eliminate the tradition and convention of uh, patriarchy, the ideology or belief of a belief system that sees that dominance and superiority of men over women. Eco-criticism, it is a study of the literature from the ecological or environmental perspective. It is a study of the relationship between literature and physical environment. New historism. New historism, it is a literary theory based on the idea of the literature should be studied and interpreted within the context of the both history of the author and the history of the critic. Thank you very much for patiently listening.